Hello, and welcome to this meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group. This is our last meeting for 2022. We greet those of you joining us on Zoom, as well as those on Facebook Live. My name is Harriet Pierce, and I am the group's coordinator. Today, we welcome Miss Marcia Iris Nurse, who will tell us how 18th to 21st century sources reveal connections. In terms of genealogy research, 18th to 21st century sources reveal connections not only about the creation of families and the interrelations between family surnames, but also expose the movement of some Barbadians from the island to other countries in search of work and to basically seek their fortune. Another aspect of these connections emanates from Barbadians becoming increasingly interested in discovering when, how, and why particular surnames were acquired by their post-1834 ancestors. In seeking answers to these questions, research by Marcia into her paternal surname, Nurse, has uncovered valuable information surrounding the lives and times of her ancestors, beginning from her 1700s enslaved, freed, and free relatives. Her presentation this evening has been designed to enlighten, educate, and inspire genealogy within a historical framework. Marcia has been actively involved in genealogy and history research for a number of years. She is no stranger to the Barbados Genealogy Group, having actively participated in our meetings, workshops, and community engagement sessions. Always curious about her immediate family, she was not only an avid listener to her family's oral history, but was always mindful of the importance of legacy objects within her home. At school, Marcia enjoyed three subjects: literature, art, and history. Now, years later, at retirement, she has made a conscious decision to re-immerse herself in activities that will allow her to rekindle these early interests. Her research into both her Barbadian maternal and paternal ancestry has allowed her to explore and document not only her ancestors' births, marriages, and burials, but to glimpse their actions, their reactions to societal upheavals within and without the island. Her findings have added deeper and often new meaning to the family stories and also to objects she inherited. Moreover, discoveries allow her to create visual images of individuals within significant periods of history. To date, Marcia's research has been shared in the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society for 2018 and for 2021. So I think we are in for a treat today. But before we hear from Marcia, just to remind you to hold your questions until the end of the presentation. Then you can either type your question in the Q&A box, or if you wish to ask your question or make your comment live on mic, we will allow you to do so. Just indicate. If you are just making comments, we will want you to put those in the chat so that we can separate the questions and the comments. For now, let's hear from Marcia.
Thank you, Harriet, for that introduction. Thank you to the administrative and staff of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, the Barbados Department of Archives, of course, the Barbados Registry members of the Genealogy Group, my family, and of course, my close friends. Welcome all to 18th to 21st century sources reveal connections. Seeing that today is the 1st of December, I've decided to share this extract from the Barbados National Anthem. These fields and hills beyond recall are now our very own. We write our names on history's page with expectations great, strict guardians of our heritage, firm craftsmen of our fate. Those words should certainly inspire Barbadians to conduct family genealogy research. The 5 key categories of sources that support this presentation and reflect how the past influences the present and the future are the oral family history, information, of course, passed down from generation to generation, personal sites, and young viewers might not be accustomed to these types of storage mechanisms. A cardboard storage box, a wooden box known as a strong box, under a mattress, a desk drawer for the more fortunate in the old days, a safe for the more fortunate in the old days, and of course, as of recent, we used to use photo albums. Some of us have discontinued that. Depositories and historical sites, the local archives, the registry, churches, cemeteries, museums, plantation lands, buildings, streets, all speak into the history of why we in Barbados carry the surnames that we do. Modern day researchers, of course, go on online sites like FamilySearch.org, Ancestry.com, CaribbeanFamilyHistory.org, EllisIsland.org, and their associate site, Heritage.StatueOfLiberty.org. Those of us who are interested in the source of our European surname may want to access houseofnames.com. Online DNA sites offering DNA tests and results indicating worldwide DNA plotting and connections to individuals known and unknown will also be presented today. Now, the surnames and place names in Barbados, when we stop to consider, it's really a legacy of Britain's colonial tyranny. As we know, the realm was England, and then it expanded to include Scotland. And then, of course, there was the inclusion of Ireland, and that changed the symbolic identity in the flags. Now, in researching your surname, one of the things you might want to do is to access the very old maps. And the old maps of Barbados, all the surnames of the landowners were strewn across the island. And the 18th century land ownership by white Barbadians and Europeans, on these two maps, the 1729 Mall map and the 1747 Boyne map, I have cropped the area of Christchurch because in conducting this research, I found out that my nurse surname was rooted in the parish of Christchurch. And the area specifically was an area of land, an expansive area of land known as Below the Rock. And on the 1729 map, I saw the letters NUR, and on the 1747 map, NURS. Other surnames, fully spelled out, were Haggart, Brady, Barker, Pittman, Butler, Chase, Hazelwood, Beckles, Ashurst, Hooper, Sandford, and Ball. That Ball name actually is also tied to the Ball family of the southern states of the United States, who owned huge expanse of land and enslaved persons. Now, the 1756 Mayo map in Christchurch clearly showed the words nurse, the surname Nurse. And the key indicated that the Nurse family were the owners of a plantation of less note. Other names you can see are Sharnock, Hooper, Richardson, Chase, Butler, and Pittman. The question we may ask was, who was this white man, the 1750s nurse, who owned a plantation of less note? And what was his place in the society of Below the Rock? To give context to that nurse family, I was able to locate the following information. In 1794, the non-resident British white Thomas and John Newton Lane inherited the plantation Mount Allen, also known as Turner's plantation bordering St. James, St. Thomas, and Newton and Sewell plantations in Christchurch. Richard Nurse was the overseer at Newton for a short period of time. For this exercise, we'll call him senior. He died in 1826. And between 1786 and 1795, he was at Sewell Plantation and at Newton Plantation from 1796 to 1798. His son, Jacob Nurse, who was baptized in St. Thomas in 1760, died in 1812, and he took over the job at Sewell from 1796 to 1799. So we see a pattern there of from father to son. Richard Nurse Sr. named his small estate in Below the Rock Walks, also known as Turner's. His white grandson, Richard Jr., born in 1793, the son of Jacob, managed it from 1826 onward. Those nurses were tracked as direct descendants of the 1680s white Robert Nurse, who between 1670 and 1702 was owner of 1¼ acres near Captain Burke. Captain Burke owned Burke's estate, and of course, that was in proximity to the other person, Robert Cooper Ashby, another name from this area below the rock. Now, the 19th century land ownership by white Barbadians again showed the name Nurse, and we see some other names surfacing: Greenwich, Carew, Ashurst, Ball, Chase again, Pilgrim, Wilcox, Sandyford, Haggart, Charnock, Hooper, Brady, and Phillips. And we know in Barbados that some of those names are still place names today. Now, in conducting the research, one has to decide on who you're going to start with. In my case, I started with myself in an ascending order to my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, to my great-great-great-grandmother, who I discovered was free mulatto Mary Ann. Now, in 1779, Mary Ann was named as the mother of 2 children, Richard and Jane Ann, both baptized in 1779, in February 1779. Now, I'll say a little bit about Jane Ann. It's interesting because she got married on the 1st of June, 1869. By then, she was 62 years old based on her birth year. And she got married to a man called London, who received an adult baptism the same day that he was getting married, the 1st of June, 1839. Then in the marriage book, it indicated that the priest allocated the surname Brigg Stork to his name, and he became London Brigg Stork. I know he was 63 years old in 1839 because I was able to find him on the 1834 slave register of Newton Plantation. He was described as London, 58 years old, Black Barbadian laborer. Now, his marriage to Mary Ann meant that she became, to Jane Ann, meant that she became Jane Ann Brigg Stork, and she was buried in 1860 with that name. Her brother, Richard, however, he became Richard Nurse, and it is interesting to note that his mother, Mary Ann, and his sister, Jane Ann, never took surnames throughout their lives until, of course, Jane Ann got married. And I think that states something about their position with regards to whoever Mary Ann was associated with, either as from an enslaved family with a history of enslavement, or associated with because of the birth of her 2 children. Now, the question we might ask is regarding the circumstantial evidence, who could have fathered those children? Well, there may be a situation of ancestral enslavement that led to Richard becoming Richard Nurse. There may also be the fact of physical presence and the question mark on paternity. Well, we can look towards Richard Sr. and his son Jacob Nurse as possible persons associated with Mary Ann and fathering these children. Jacob certainly would have been around the same age as Mary Ann, a mere teenager between 13 and 15 when she birthed the children. Now I'm going to take you now to a source document, and the source document is the 1779 baptism of the mulatto child Richard in Christchurch, and of course it will mention Jane Ann. The actual source document is the Christchurch Parish Church Baptism Book, where on the 3rd of February 1779, the baptism was written into the book of Richard, the son of Mary Ann, a free mulatto born on the 9th of October 1774. And on the same day, Jane Ann, daughter of Mary Ann, a free mulatto born the 17th of December 1777. Now, based on the baptism year, this child was a person who later in life becomes Richard Nurse, a shoemaker. This baptism record indicated that he was 5 years old at baptism. His burial record stated he was born in Christchurch. In my research between the years 1770 and 1780, he was the only free mulatto child named Richard evident on the records I sourced. He would therefore, based on his year of birth, 1774, be 87, at his death in May 1862 at Rose Cottage in Christchurch. Let us now go to the source document of his burial. The 1862 burial record of my great-great-grandfather, Mulatto Richard Nurse, the shoemaker, indicated that he was buried on the 6th of May, 1862, that he was 82 years old. He was a shoemaker. His abode was Rose Cottage, the same as his mother, and his place of birth was this parish. Now, in the previous slide, I did indicate, 2 slides forward, I did indicate on the slide that Mary Ann died in 1854. She died in the cholera epidemic, and the abode on the record was Rose Cottage. So she lived with her son at Rose Cottage, which was a small plantation in proximity to Newton Plantation. Now, this was an important lead towards the acquisition of the Nurse surname and the creation of a legacy in one family. We recognize the presence of the Nurse family in Below the Rock, and we also know, based on the slave registers, that White Richard Nurse Sr., his son Jacob, and his grandson Richard Jr. owned a shoemaker between 1817 and 1834. Now, this offered a possibility for young pre-mulatto Richard to apprentice as a shoemaker, and as an adult, sad to say, because he's my great-great-grandfather, but he also owned a shoemaker on the register I found for him. Now, the location of the mulatto nurses in Rose Cottage near Newton is another factor that influences that use of the surname Nurse. Now, the expansion of the family tree grew because my great-great-grandparents, Richard Nurse and Polly, had a relationship, and that relationship led to Polly being named as the mother of these children, Richard, Elizabeth Mary, Suki Ann, Samuel Henry, and Lord Brougham. Now, in 1834, Polly is described on the slave registers as a 45-year-old domestic. She also became known as Polly Legal, and sometimes referred to as Polly Ann Legal. And the calculation that Richard was born around 1823, Elizabeth Mary 1825, Suki Ann 1827, Samuel Henry 1830, and Lord Brougham 1832 is based on information on the slave registers of the person who owned my great-great-grandmother, Polly, and her children. I just want to say something about that name, Lord Brougham, as well. The name Lord Brougham mirrors the name of a man in the Parliament in London, in the British Parliament, and it would be hardly likely that Polly, an enslaved domestic, would have known of that person. So it's likely that the priest at the time, the rector at Christchurch Parish Church, who was J.H. Otterson, D.D., he applied the name Brougham to this child, the name Lord Brougham to this infant. In his baptism book, the rector wrote, the child's name was Lord Brougham, parents, '(S), Polly Legal, owner's name, John Legal. Now, the fact that he wrote what we recognize as a surname behind Polly's name is not an indication that she legally had a surname. It is an indication that relates to who owns her. No enslaved person had a surname by law. They may have it as an attachment after a first name, and it relates to either their present owner or past ownership or family ownership. Now, what is interesting is that I wanted to find out whether Lord Brougham, that infant, became Lord Brougham Nurse or Lord Brougham Legal. I was not able to find that exact name, but the 1857 burial record of Lord Brougham Nurse, 25 years old, of Rockley Hall, born in Christchurch, makes his year of birth 1832. Was he the enslaved infant named in 1832 as Lord Brougham? More than likely. The minister who dealt with the burial of Lord Brougham Nurse was C.C. Gill. Now, C.C. Gill was the rector at Christchurch Parish Church in 1834, when my other enslaved ancestors, the older siblings of Lord Brougham, were baptized. And he wrote in the Christchurch baptism book, Bet, Sukian, Sam Henry, and Richard, with their mother's name as Polly and their owner's name as John Legal. This is the actual baptism book. Now, the name John Legal took me into the parish of Christ Church records of registers of enslaved persons known as returns. And on the return of John Legal, I saw 4 persons' names. None of them were Polly and her children, but on the opposite page, the return of Alice Legal of slaves her own property indicated Polly 45, colored, Barbadian domestic, Elizabeth Mary 9 years old, colored domestic. She is the person the priest wrote BET because he didn't want to write out Elizabeth Mary. It was too large for the column. Richard, 11 years old, colored Barbadian. Sukian, 7 years, colored Barbadian. Sam Henry, 4 years old, colored Barbadian, and Lord Brougham, 2 years old. So the actual return of Alice Legal proved the ownership under Alice and not under John. Alice Legal was a relative of John Legal, and he was the person who the priest wrote. Perhaps he took the information to the priest. The Legal name is associated with the Rising Sun Plantation, becomes associated. Now, the Legal and nurses' residence in Below the Rock Christ Church was evidence on the 1825 Barelial map, where the Legals are right there positioned on the map and in proximity to where the nurse name used to be. I also discovered on the 1847 list of property owners that Richard Nurse, who would be white, Richard Nurse Jr., the grandson of Richard Nurse, the overseer, by 1847, he's named as owning 31 acres, 1 road, 24 purchase, Below the Rock, and another Richard owned 4 acres at First Step. Now, one of the things that I was interested in is whether my enslaved or free ancestors may have accessed education. And I accessed the report of the Incorporated Society for the Conversion of Religious Instruction and Education of the Negro slaves in the British West Indies Islands for the year 1827. And the report is dated 1828, and it indicated that there were 24 estates in Christ Church, and there were 24 charity schools. And the report indicated that those schools were attended by 92 scholars who were all white. Now, this report is very interesting. I have the statistics for all the islands or all the parishes, but we are dealing with Christ Church, and I thought I would share that. So the report also classified in Christ Church 1,650 people as white. It classified 120 as free colored, which would include mulattoes, and it included 10,684 and described them as slaves. That meant the total population was 12,454 when my ancestors were present in Christ Church. Is it no wonder that Samuel Henry, who became Samuel Henry Nurse, remember he was registered as a 4-year-old colored infant in the 1834 return of slaves of Alice Legal, that he is illiterate in 1861 when he gets married. Now, the Nurse surname moved to St. Michael because Samuel Henry was a coachman to a white family who owned a property near Rose Cottage, near Newton, and near Rising Sun. That family's surname was Armstrong, and Armstrong's married into Greenwiches. And he was a coachman with that family. And in 1861, he is illiterate because on the marriage record, there's an X, the mark of X of Samuel Henry Nurse. He was 30 years old. He was now residing in Colmarock, a bachelor, and he didn't name his father on the record. His bride, Christian Aline Boyne, was baptized on the 4th of April, 1839 in St. Michael. She was also illiterate. You see X, the mark of Christian Aline Boyne, on the marriage record of the Christ Church, Parish Church, on the 16th of May, 1861. She is described as 25 years old, a spinster or seamstress of near Berks. Near Berks is Berks Plantation. And she, the witness, also one of the important things is to look at the witnesses on the marriage records. And on this record, her brother-in-law, Thomas Richard Drayton Small, was the witness And by that time, he and Christian Alleen's sister had about 5 or 6 children. So I can only imagine that she was probably assisting her sister as well when she met up with Samuel Henry Nurse. And that's the reason she was now living in Christchurch. So Thomas Richard Drayton Small was a teacher at 1861. Now, my great-grandmother, Christian Alleen Bowen, died in 1875, and my great-grandfather, Samuel Henry Nurse, remarried, and he remarried to Martha Jane Walcott. And I found the 1852 baptism record of Martha Jane, that she was from St. Jude's, St. George, and the baptism was the 28th of February, 1852. She was the daughter of Thomas Benjamin and Mary Hannah Walcott. And her parents resided at Middleton. Her father was a laborer. Now, this marriage, my great-grandfather's second marriage took place on the 22nd of May, 1884. And it took place at St. Paul's Chapel. He was described as 50 years old. We know he was 54 because he's born in 1830. He was a widower, a coachman, and he was living at Hastings Road. He named his father on this record as Richard Nurse, the shoemaker. This was the first very important lead in going back to Richard Nurse, the shoemaker, and to Mary Ann, my great-great-great-grandmother. Samuel was described as a widower, a coachman at Hastings, as I said, and you can see that Martha Jane was 32 years old, and she was also a domestic at Hastings, and she named her father as Thomas Walcott Butler. So we see that this young woman, born in 1852, is illiterate, and it's now 1884 when she's marrying. Now, the 1903 burial of 73-year-old Samuel Henry Nurse of Hastings indicated that he was born in Christchurch, and this location in Hastings mirrors the oral family history. Once my father said to me that his grandfather, Samuel Henry, he went to visit him, and he had to, his father took him up on the beach side and into the house through the rear entrance, not through the front gate. My great-grandparents, Samuel Henry and Christian Alleen Nurse's second son, Samuel Beresford Nurse, born in 1864, and Isidore Margaret Critchlow were married in 1889. I just want to slip back quickly to the births of those children. And on this slide, my great-grandparents, Samuel Henry Nurse, the domestic, and Christian Alleen Bowen, were named on 4 baptism records of 4 boys. I didn't put the 4th record up because he died in infancy. But the first son, Charles Henry, was born in 1862. The second son, Samuel Beresford, who became my grandfather, was born in 1865. And Benjamin was born in 1870. Now, the first 2 records are at the cathedral, and the priest there simply wrote Christian Ellen and not Alleen. He indicated that my great-grandfather was a domestic living in Tweedside Road, and he repeated that same information in 1865. St. Paul's Chapel became the baptism place in 1870 when my great-grandparents baptized Benjamin, their 3rd son. And in this case, the priest didn't worry with any middle names at all. He just wrote Samuel and Christian Nurse, but he wrote her maiden name as Bowen. And the couple were residing at Culmarock by that time. That information I gave gives context to Samuel Beresford Nurse, born 1864. Now, he is my grandfather, and he married my grandmother, Isidore Margaret Critchlow, in 1889. And the marriage took place at St. Paul's Chapel. And what is very important about this record, it was the first record I found of literacy in my family, because the groom and the bride signed. And I had that record transcribed by the staff of the archives and the registry to a modern day certificate of marriage. So we see here the modern day certificate of marriage transcribed in 2016 for me. Samuel Nurse and Isadora Margaret Critchlow were married on the 20th of June, 1889. He was described as 25 years, a bachelor, she 22, a spinster, he a butler, she a seamstress. They both lived in Colmarock. Samuel indicated his father was Samuel Henry Nurse, a coachman, and Isadora, my grandmother, indicated that her father was Edward Critchlow, a mason. Very important record for me, showing literacy for the first time in my family, my Nurse family. The 1865 baptism of my grandmother, Isadora Margaret Critchlow, evidenced my great-grandparents, my Critchlow great-grandparents. On Isadora Margaret's baptism in 1865, her father was named as Edward Redmond Critchlow and her mother as Margaret Critchlow, nee Welch. Well, that Welch name took me right back into Christchurch. Both to my freed family who adopted the surname Welch, and of course to the white Welches who owned them. And at that point, my great-grandparents in 1865 were living in Britons Hill, and my great-grandfather was a mason. Now, the union between Samuel Beresford Nurse and Isadora Margaret Nurse, nee Critchlow, produced several children. And the records I have here, 8 records. The first child, Arthur Beresford, born 1890, Henry Alfred, born 1891, he's my father. Herbert Nathaniel, born 1893, Irene, born 1894, Roy Llewellyn, born 1896, Belfie Gladstone, 1897, Reginald Brighton, 1899, and Meta Isadora, 1900. The images here are cropped from a group photograph taken in 1894, and the children's names blocked in purple are the children who died in infancy. The baptism records of my father and my uncles they all give important information. First of all, we see that the church that was used by my grandparents was St. Paul's Chapel in Bay Street, Bridgetown, St. Michael. Secondly, we see that switched to the African Methodist Episcopal in Upper Colmarock, and that is a social statement, and it also probably is based on racial experiences that the couple had experienced by this time. Now, my grandfather's occupation changed from a butler, we see, to a domestic servant and to a shopkeeper, and then finally to a ship's steward. And this mirrored the oral family history, and also is mirrored in the fact that my grandparents moved from Culloden Road and they went to live in Britain's Cross Road. The reason for that was that my grandfather moved his wife and children into Britain's Cross Road to be close to her Critchlow family when he was beginning to make moves to work consistently at sea. Now, just before that, he set up a shop, and my father always lamented that his mother gave credit to so many people in the 1900s that this shop went to ruin and they had to move again, and you'll see evidence of that later on. Now, the amount of records, there were so many records that I found of my grandfather at sea, but I'm just sharing a few with you, and we won't go into all of these details that I've highlighted. But the first record that I'll share is a 1905 record when my grandfather, Samuel Beresford Nurse, is traveling from Halifax into New York, and he indicates that he is going to rejoin the brig, the Lenora, in New York. Now, he's traveling as a passenger, which often happen for seafarers, and he's described as 39 years old. He can read and write, and he paid for his own ticket, and he has $21 on him. Now, in 1905 in May, later that year, we also see that he's from Halifax again. And again, it says that he reshipped at Bedford on the Lenora. One of the important pieces of information on the 1905 record was that he stated that he was in the US before and in Boston in 1904. So we can establish probably that's the first time that he left the West Indies and the South American travels that he did, and was now positioning himself between Canada and the United States. Now, the 1920 record, 15 years later, showed that he had become a cook. And that was mirrored exactly what my father said about him. And he was now leaving from London, heading back into New York. And in July, that was April, and in July, he's heading from Para, Brazil via St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands. In December, he's heading from Matanza, Cuba, back into New York in December 1920. In 1923, he's leaving from Sicily, Italy. And later on in 1923, in October, he's leaving from Cape Town, South Africa. I can't go into all the details because we've lost a bit of time today, but we can see other names there, and the men are described as British West Indian, and the names sound very much like Barbadian names: Scott, Tate, Dewsbury, Whitaker, Pollard, Amy, Price, Williams, Morris, and I've even seen Pragnell on one of the records. Also note that the seafarers tended to give a much lower age than they actually were. There was no paperwork. No one had a baptism record, a birth certificate, and their weight changed drastically up and down, their height. And we also see that racially, when they enter New York, it doesn't matter what complexion you were. If you stated you were British, West Indian, they put a line through it. You were African, Black African. They would normally put Black African or African Black through any such descriptions. Now, in 1934, on January 4th, I found Samuel, and he gave his age here, and they wrote it's 52 years old. Calculating his date of birth, we know he would have been 70 years young. So he obviously, and I hope I inherit that trait of looking younger than you are. He was declared as a cook, leaving from Halifax into New York. And he is described as African Black, 5'6", 170 pounds. We see some other British West Indian men listed there: Clark, Pickering, Green, Matthews, Lashley, James, Chapman, Adams, Marshall, and Clark. Certainly they sound like all Barbadians. My grandmother also left Barbados, and in 1923, I was able to find her on this manifest on ellisisland.org. She's indicated that she's 54 years old. She's married. She's a dressmaker. She can speak, read, and write English. She's a citizen of Great Britain because, of course, Barbados is a colony, and she's heading from Cuba into the United States. She gives her address in Cuba as De Los Cias, and she stayed at Sidi Marquez, a friend. The 2-page document allowed me to see that she stated that she paid for her ticket herself. She had $60 on her, and she declared she was going to her son, Arthur B. Nurse, at 225 West 1299 Street, New York. Her intention was to stay 1 year. Her health was good. She had no deformity. She was 5'6", complexion black, hair black, eyes black, and no marks of identification. She was born in Bridgetown, Barbados. Now, my uncle Arthur Beresford had left Barbados earlier, and his mother going to him in 1923 was an indication that he was in New York. But this World War I United States of America registration card clearly showed that he indicated he was 28 years old. He was living in Cook County in Illinois. His address was the corner of Montgomery and Orchard Lane, Highland Park. He indicated his birth date as the 15th of May. We know he was born in June 1890. He described himself as a cook. His dependent was his mother. He was single. He was described as a Negro. Physical features: tall, slender, dark brown eyes, hair black. And from this record, I was able to learn that he was literate enough to sign his name, Arthur Beresford Nurse, the only document I have with his signature. The 1920 US Census also shows him there, Arthur B. Nurse, a servant, a mulatto, 28 years old, single, West Indian English, in Cook County, Illinois, and it indicated that he arrived in the USA in 1908. So he was 18 years old when he entered the United States. The 1951 Suffield, Connecticut record in this directory showed that he was there in Connecticut for a short time. Now, my grandmother certainly didn't stay in the United States for 1 year. She just never came back to the 1940s. And that gelled with what my father said. And I found her on the California voters registration. It is interesting to note that the United States had verified women's right to vote in 1920. If Isadora Margaret Nurse was in Barbados, she would not have been able to vote to the 1950, I think it's 1952 in Barbados. She arrived back in Barbados between the beginning and the end of World War II. Now, my uncle Arthur died in California, and the source record indicated that he was in Pasadena. We see him here in 1894 at 4 years old. Now, the information from my father was that 2 of his brothers went to World War I, and I was able to find them on the British West Indies Regiment list. This site is an interesting site and one that persons interested in the British West Indies Regiment, which are the non-white soldiers leaving from the West Indies and from Barbados, of course. You can access this website for information. We ask ourselves, did they register for money, propensity for fighting, love of Britain, or love of Barbados, or a combination of all? We don't know. What we do know is that 2 of my uncles, Herbert Nathaniel and Roy Llewellyn Nurse, traveled together on the Verdala on the 20th of September 1915. That website gives an A to Z listing of all the men who left in the British West Indies Regiment. The brothers are listed as Herbert Nathaniel and Roy Llewellyn. And next to Herbert's name on this website, it says returned medically unfit the 27th of April, 1919. That was Herbert Nathaniel. Other records I've been able to locate from my uncle Herbert show that he was private number 935 on this roll card. He also has an unclaimed medal on this document created in the 17th of March, 1922. And Herbert, by 1922, was a seafarer. He was recorded as a waiter on the SS Guyana, leaving Barbados for New York, and he arrived on the March 14th, 1922. He was described as 38 years old, African Black, British, 5'6", 140 pounds. Interestingly enough, in 1924, his age has decreased to 33 years old. He's 5'6", African Black, British, 145 pounds. And this is on the 31st of October, 1924. We see him as a waiter. And on this record, he declared that he was at sea 19 years, which would mean that since he's born in 1893, that he went to sea in 1905 when he was 12 years old. Maybe at that point, he said he was 16. And he would have worked on ships, then gone to World War I, and then come back and resumed seafaring. My uncle is buried in 1946 at the Westbury Cemetery, and he's buried in an open government plot. And his burial record indicated that he was an ex-soldier. His abode was Black Rock. We see him here, aged 1 year old in 1894. Now, information on the British West Indies Regiment is most interesting, and I think viewers might want to look at this website I've named at the bottom of the screen. My other uncle, Roy Llewellyn, his pension record shows on FamilySearch.org, and on that record, I also saw that in 1919, when he was, discharged, he was 23 years old. His military number, he was private 936. He was a reserve in the 5th Battalion, and he served in the 1st Battalion. This photograph is a photograph from that site showing the men in Jamaica, the Jamaican men receiving their medals. Now, Roy's discharge documents, I was able to locate, and he was discharged on the 10th of July, 1919, and they wrote across the documents, King Street, Barbados, as his address. The records indicated that he had no grounds for award for disability. And the other information said that he was 22 years old, a private when he was discharged. He was single, and they knew that he was a clerk at King Street in Barbados. Now, this document, these discharge documents are prepared in 1922. World War had ended quite a few years before. From the document, I also found that he enlisted fully on the 3rd of September. Throughout his career, he had a very good military character. The documents, as I said, were prepared in Kingston, Jamaica. His health was A grade. And on this casualty form and active service, I found that he embarked at Devonport in England after leaving Barbados in September. He embarked after training, initial training, on the 21st of January 1916, and he arrived in Alexandria, Egypt on the 2nd of May 1916. The record also indicated that he went on to Port Said in Egypt on the 27th of April 1919, and he was in Toronto, Italy on the 1st of May 1919. At the bottom of the record, there was a brief indicating his travels, West Indies. So he was with the British West Indies Regiment here in Barbados from the 1st right through to the 19th, being prepared at sea out of Barbados on the 20th of September 1915, arrived, and home in this case means England, arrived home on the 5th of October and left on the 20th of January 1916 for Egypt, and he was there from the 20th of January 1916 until the 29th of May 1919. During that time, he was part of the British Expeditionary Force between the 3rd of May and the 29th of May 1919. And then he was on sea from Egypt back to England between the 30th of May, arrived through the 20th of June, and then into Barbados, into the West Indies between the 13th of June, arriving on the 10th of July into Barbados. Now, I think that anyone watching out there who has an interest in World War I should really read, access the site that I've listed and read a little bit about the British West Indies Regiment mutiny. And I'll quote from the site. It said, a secret colonial memo from 1919 uncovered by researchers for a Channel 4 program on the Toronto mutiny showed that the British government realized that everything had changed. To quote from this secret document, it said, the British said, nothing we can do will alter the fact that the black man has begun to think and feel himself as good as the white. Hopefully that would encourage someone to make a movie or documentary on the British West Indies Regiment and maybe Barbadian men. The medical history continues in the folder, and it showed that my uncle, Roy, was examined on 2 days, the 3rd and the 5th. He was 19 years old in 1915 when he was examined. His chest was 134 pounds. Sorry, his weight was 134 pounds. His height was 5 foot 8 inches. His chest was 35 inches, and he could expand it 3 inches. Healthy young man. Now, he had an unclaimed medal, and this document is dated 1922. Roy went off to sea, and in 1920, he was a cabin boy, described as 23 years old, 5 foot 11 inches, 150 pounds. So after World War I, he became a seafarer. And he then eventually left Barbados and made his way into Cook County, Illinois, to his brother Arthur. And he is recorded buried in Chicago. And the burial took place on the 20th of January, 1928. He died on the 16th of January. The burial record indicated that he was a porter. Racially, he was described as black. His wife is Mary Nurse. I haven't been able to find out her maiden name yet and where she was born. Now, there were 2 sons of my grandparents. My father, Henry Alfred, who was the 2nd son, born in 1891, and Reginald Brighton, who was the last son. Those 2 sons did not go off to war, to World War I, to serve. 17-year-old seafarer Reginald Brighton was found on the 26th of April 1917 on the Vestries, a ship coming from South American ports. Interestingly enough, when asked who his nearest relative was, he said his mother is a door nurse in Bay Street. And this mirrored the family oral history because after the shop failed in Britain's Crossroad, my grandmother moved to her Murray family, extended family of the Critchlows, in the Carlisle Bay Street area, and her sons moved with her before she headed off to Cuba. We see other seafarers, young men, with my uncle on this boat. And there are Tinley Warren, 20 years old of Bay Street, Audley O'Neill, 18 of Bay Street, and Wallace Foster, who was 16 years old of Gemmett's Lane. So those young men likely all knew each other. They were close friends. Now, Brighton spent a lot of time, my father said, in South America, and he was in Buenos Aires. And he's here on November the 17th as an assistant steward on a ship. He too made his way into Cook County to his brother, Arthur Beresford, by 1922. He was in Barbados for quite a while, from 1917 to 1920-21. And then he shipped out and he goes to his brother in Cook County, where he marries Beulah Johnson. And the record indicated that the marriage took place in 1922, and that Brighton, who is Reginald Brighton, but here he's using his name Brighton. He was more commonly known as Brighton than Reginald. He was 23 years old, and that Beulah was 20 years old. And I wanted to find out a little bit about Beulah Johnson. And I found on the 1910 US Census a Beulah Johnson in Cook County, a mulatto, 2 years old. If this is Beulah who married my uncle, she would only have been 14 years old based on this age here in 1922 when she got married. That's not an unusual thing either for this time. Maybe this record is incorrect and she wasn't 2. Who knows? Or maybe this is not her. My uncle, Reginald Brighton, spent a lot of time in New York. I'm not sure if Mrs. Nurse spent that time with him, but he returned to Barbados and he was buried on the 28th of August, 1946. He was described as a clerk of King Street, and he had a private grave. And this is a photograph of that grave at Westbury Cemetery. My grandmother, Isadora Margaret, as you saw, was she's pictured here in 1894 from the group photograph. This is an image of her. She's only 29 years old. She already has 3 children, Arthur Beresford, Henry Alfred, and Herbert Nathaniel. We know she's born in 1865. She got married in 1889. She had 8 children by the age of 35 years old. She traveled to Cuba and the US. Her husband was a seafarer, and she's buried at Westbury Cemetery. The place of burial of her husband, Samuel, remains unknown. Now, I visited her grave, and I also looked at her burial record, and she died on the 8th of May, 1949. She was 82 years old. Based on her birth at 1865, we know she was 84. Her son, my father, Henry Alfred, buried her in a private grave, and it was the grave that his mother had buried her daughter, her infant daughter, Irene, in 1897. What was interesting for me, and that's why it's good to visit these grave sites, is that there was a gravestone next to my grandmother's grave, and it was the gravestone of a Viola Critchlow Gibson's 1979 burial. She was age 65. She died in Brooklyn. And I was able to discover the 1945 to 1946 rate book that Verona and Viola Critchlow paid tax on the estate of Ursula Critchlow, who was Nee Callender, deceased wife of Clifford Critchlow, a seaman of Seaman's Village, Britain's Crossroad. So Clifford Critchlow and my grandfather, Samuel Beresford, would certainly have known each other. All of those families knew each other well because of marriage and, of course, profession, both here and in the United States. Now, I inherited a mahogany strong box. As I said, the young viewers won't understand what a strong box is. But in the old days, people placed documents they considered with tremendous importance in a locked box. And in the strong box that I inherited has over 1,000 pieces of paper and different pieces of different documents. I can't share them all with you for obvious reasons. The oldest document in there is the 1894 photo of Isadora Margaret Nurse and her 3 sons. Then there's a 1916 letter from a father to the suitor of her daughter, to the suitor of his daughter. And that letter was written to my father from a gentleman who'd observed my father chatting and speaking and visiting with his daughter. And the gentleman wrote my father a letter. My father shortly after married her. That was my father's first wife. Now, in these strong boxes, you get a good idea of the socioeconomic lifestyle and life of people. And I'd just like to share that this 1948 Surgeon's Bill was really interesting because it showed that 6 days accommodation was $60. The operation itself was $50. And a 1945 Radio Distribution Barbados Limited installation receipt showed that the subscription was $1. There are so many interesting documents. The 1948 Cape Shepherd and Company bill and receipts show that a gent's bicycle was $91.28. My father then paid for a car license in Christchurch, and it was $24 that he paid. And he bought a car, the handwritten receipts for a car that cost $1,025. It was an Austin 8 motor car. However, he didn't stop riding his bicycle, and I know him riding his bicycle. And I'm born in 1956. In 1951, he bought from C.F. Parsons and Company Limited a gent's bicycle, replacing the old one for $81.80. So we see the price of bicycles has gone down because cars, of course, are now the thing. And in 1951, he paid for 2 gallons of gas at the Morris service station in Robert Street, $1.18. I'll share another document here with you, and that's a 1952 Colonial Secretary's Office receipt for payment for marriage license, $4. That was the marriage license used to marry my mother, in 1952. Now, my father's first wife died in December 1944. And in this strong box is this receipt, and it's the Black Rock establishment. The place is owned by a Mr. Brown. The receipt is written to Mr. Nurse Esquire. We see that our accounts are rendered monthly. We see the telephone number is 3369 of the establishment, the Black Rock Garage and Funeral Establishment. And this receipt has a Barbados British Colonial 1p stamp. Now, I was able to gel this, mirror this document in a strong box with CaribbeanFamilyHistory.org, which is a website dealing with burials. And the burial of my father's first wife, which I knew some information about her, but I was able to see that the couple lived in Bamboo Gap, Black Rock, so I could pinpoint that information from Caribbean Family History. So it's always good to do cross checks. Another interesting document in the mahogany strong box is this 1952 furniture craftsman's receipt in the handwriting of the customer, Henry A. Nurse. Now, I know my father's handwriting very well, so I know this is his handwriting, and clearly the gentleman making the furniture did not want to give him a receipt or couldn't write out a receipt. So my father wrote it out, and he wrote, received from Mr. H.A. Nurse a sum of $100 on account of mahogany furniture's itemized below that he has agreed to build for him. My father paid a deposit of $100. One Morris suite, 1 settee and 3 chairs was $140. 1 double bedstead was $45. 1 wardrobe with mirror, $170. 1 bureau and seat, $105. Total $460. Balance on completion, $360. And we see a Barbados British Colonial 2-cent stamp is used on this record. This is January 1952, when he's preparing a house that he had remodeled in anticipation of his marriage to my mother later that year. My sister and I own this furniture. Oral family history connects the contents of the strong box. So we see that the ancient meets modern, where we have the strong box here, the mahogany strong box. It has a lock and key. I transferred some of the documents to acid-free sleeves and an acid-free folder, and I also transferred some to the electronic storage on a flash drive. Now, bringing us right into the modern day, a researcher who can access DNA kits and DNA results. No surprises here, 49% Africa, 51% European. These are my DNA results from the utilization of a Ancestry.com DNA kit. The results are often updated, and this is an updated July 2022, and the difference is that they just pulled out Nigeria and given the specific percentage for Nigeria. Now, we also receive on DNA results, we receive matches, and the 221st person on my list, I had uploaded an image of myself and I saw the letters MN, and then I saw you and Marcia Nurse. And this person, it stated, was my 4th to 6th cousin, 1% DNA across 21 centimorgans. And the two MNs, we met by chance, is anything by chance, in Barbados in June 2022. The other MN is also Marcia, and she's Marcia A. Nurse, and I'm Marcia ID Nurse. She's born in 1945 in the USA, and I'm born in 1956 here in Barbados. Here we are at the museum, and here we are at the beach in Christchurch, 4th to 6th cousins. Well, we conducted a bit of research. And the research led us to the 1834 return of John C. Nurse of slaves, the property of Sarah E. Downs, an invalid. Now, in 1834, Sarah E. Downs was white Sarah Downs, who owned the small estate of Middleton in St. George with 32 enslaved people. John C. Nurse was white John Clark Nurse, who lived on the same estate and owned 4 enslaved people by 1834. In 1834, Downs owned an enslaved Prince William, 12 years old Black Barbadian. The surname Nurse became attached to some of Middleton's enslaved people. John Clark Nurse was likely the person from whom it originated. For instance, enslaved Frank became Francis Nurse. The source documents of Marcia A. Nurse's ancestors led to Downs' estate, Middleton, St. George. Her great-great-grandparents, surnamed Nurse, were from Middleton. Their son, William Augustus Nurse, was the father of her grandfather, born 1885 in Barbados, who was named Prince William Augustus Nurse. 2 names of former enslaved Prince William. Prince William Augustus Nurse was located in the USA by 1908, described as Black. Perhaps white John Clark Nurse of Middleton, St. George was related to Newton plantation overseer, white Richard Nurse of Walks Turner's Christchurch. Perhaps a child born of a consort of John Clark Nurse was blood linked or married to one of Marcia A. Nurse's paternal ancestors. Questions remain. Now, another match on my DNA results came 5th in the list of matches. The first 4 people I know very well, they're my family. I could pick up the telephone and call them anytime. But the 5th person I didn't know, her name turned out to be Carrie Chase. So here we're looking at my DNA results. Now, you know that my paternal ancestors, surname Nurse, are from below the rock. I've shared that today with you. And you see the trail of data used to establish that information. Initial investigations and research has led to the paternal ancestor surnamed Chase for Kerry originating in below the rock and of course in the United States. My DNA results say that we are 2nd to 3rd cousins, 4% DNA across 261 centimorgans. Now, Another interesting record for persons are always persons searching for people who went to Panama. And the 20th century records highlight movement from below the rock to Panama and the USA. This 1990 Panama Canal application for photo metal check employees indicated a person named Herbert Chase. He actually was baptized in Barbados. Fitzherbert Chase, his father was William Chase, a pilgrim in Below the Rock, Christchurch, Barbados. On this Panama Canal application, we see that Herbert is in the dredging division. His wage is $43 per month. He arrived in the Isthmus on the 22nd of August, 1910. And records also indicated that he immigrated from Cristobal, Panama in 1920. He got married to Sarah Hicks in Morton, Pennsylvania in 1929. So we see the movement of persons from below the rock to Panama and to the USA. The photo was taken on the 14th of December, 1916. Now, some other records came up from below the rock in doing the research, and these immigration records show how not almost an entire family went into the United States. And we see that 4 single Barbadian-born Chases went to the United States. 3 adult siblings declared their father as William Chase of Below the Rock, Christchurch. And the said William Chase was declared as the grandfather of 1 Barbadian-born child. Well, in May 1921, Floretta Chase, 21, single, said she was going to her brother, Herbert Chase, in Philadelphia. So that's Herbert, who had worked so hard in the Panama Canal and now was in the United States. She was followed by her sister Ermi, 22 years old, single, on April the 22nd. And then Ina followed, another sister, on 1923. And she was taken with her a child called Orban, who was 5 years old. When he arrived, actually, he left Barbados in May 1923. His mom had already got married on the 7th of June, and she was married to a seafarer, MacDonald Knight, who worked on ships with my uncles. The family went on. She went on to birth 3 children. The last one is Reginald, 1927. The Chase name is interesting from below the rock because White Richard Chase was the person who was awarded a compensation in 1836 for 36 enslaved people on Breedy's plantation below the rock, Christchurch. If you remember, the map showed Brady, B-R-E-A, but here it's Breedy's plantation. Richard H. Chase was a descendant of the White Thomas Chase, whose burial in 1812 first alerted mourners of the movement of coffins in the Chase vault. The coffins would have held the remains of White Chases and their ancestors. The Chase surname, like the nurse surname, transferred to some free persons of color pre and post 1834 in areas within Below the Rock, Christchurch. The legend of the 1800s shifted coffins within the Chase vault continues into 2022. Well, DNA matches offer questions, coincidences, connections, no clear answers. Could Marcia and Marcia Idy have the same Black, African, or Barbadian ancestral enslaved or free relative? Could Marcia and Marcia Idy have the same white, European, or Barbadian ancestral relative? Could Marcia and Marcia Idy have an ancestral link based exclusively upon physical indicators on the Barbados and global DNA landscape? Or is it a combination of all and or more? Could Carrie and Marcia Idy have the same Black, African, or Barbadian ancestral enslaved or free relative? Could Carrie and Marcia Idy have the same white, European, or Barbadian ancestral relative? Could Carrie and Marcia Idy have an ancestral link based exclusively upon physical indicators on the Barbados and global DNA landscape? Or is it a combination of all and or more? Well, we also identify by emblems. And of course, as we say, this is who we are across the island. We recognize the Barbados Independence flag as part of our identity. November the 30th, 1966 is our Independence Day. It's also St. Andrew's Day. And St. Andrew's Day is obviously recognized in Scotland. Here we have the flag of Barbados, the coat of arms of Barbados, and the map of Barbados with its 11 parishes reflects the legacy of Britain and the Church of England. Discovering in part, this is who I am, the last known descendant of Mary Ann, bearing this family's ancestral surname Nurse. I am Henry Alfred Nurse's second daughter. Here I am at 64 years old in 2020. 95 years young, Henry Alfred Nurse, pictured in 1986. He died in 1989. We remember him as a 3-year-old in 1894. Another way we look for identity, we can go down to the Golden Square Freedom Park in Bridgetown, Barbados. And this art installation, mainly depicting the surnames of former European colonists and enslavers. Here I am looking at the Nurse and Critchlow surnames. We're coming to a close now, and I'd just like to say that it's been extremely rewarding to research the various sources in order to create a legacy document focused on my inheritance of the surname Nurse. The research allowed me to gain a greater insight to my ancestors' lives and their places within the socioeconomic and historical landscape of Barbados and the world. This resulted in my having a deeper appreciation of the family's connections between themselves, to their communities, to Barbados, to the world, and to myself. The research is in no way complete and requires further in-depth investigations of slave plantations and other property ownership in and around Britain's Hill, Culloden Road, Culmer Rock, St. Michael, and within the parishes of Christchurch and St. Lucie. Research will also extend to the pre-1834 presence on the island of the Alleyne, Bowen, Welch, Redmond, Critchlow families. Most importantly, contact needs to be made with my familial descendants of the mid-1850s Nurses, Critchlows, Welches, and Bowens. Also required will be an in-depth analysis of certain ships' records related to West Indian seafarers between 1890 and 1940s. The silent experience in trying to establish the various branches of my extended Nurse and Critchlow families has been deafening. Hopefully, sharing this presentation to a broad audience, some pertinent information may be revealed to expand the legacy of the Nurse surname and other extended familial surnames, some documented with clear connections, others not. As we look to the future, we look to the records of the archives here in Barbados, in St. James, Barbados, and we look towards the proposed Barbadian Heritage District at Newton Plantation, Christchurch. This presentation is a dedication to my enslaved and freed ancestors. And I'd like to leave you with this thought. Our families' genealogies exist as legacies in our very beings, and more widely, explains nothing less than who we are as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Thank you so much, Marcia. Thank you for a very enlightening discussion. We are going to open the floor now. I know we've been here for quite a while due to our technical difficulties. So we are going to open the floor for any comments or questions directed to the presenter. Okay, the floor is now open for questions or comments. Okay, we do have a question coming in. Okay, this is from Marietta Carter Narcis. You did a phenomenal job on this presentation. I have been working on mine for a while. However, it requires me spending more time in Vim. So here's someone who appreciates your presentation this evening, Marcia.
Thank you.
Okay. And we want to remind persons, she actually wants to speak online. Okay, you are on mic, Marietta.
Hi, Marcia. I don't know if you remember me.
Of course I do.
You did, I mean, congratulations. You did such a phenomenal job on this. I have a lot of records. I spent a lot of time in the archives gathering information about my grandfather and his father and his grandfather. And, you know, I was stuck. I couldn't find any information on what would have been my great grandmother. I couldn't find any information on her. But I applaud you for the amount of work that you put in into this, because I truly appreciate all the hard work, because I know this was no easy task of putting these things together. And I do have a strong box. I have a mahogany strong box belonging to my great aunt. And I laughed when you said that, because that contained letters of
Yes.
which I need to put them in acid-free paper and acid-free wrapping, but I did try to copy them, because by the time I got them, they were crumbled, you know?
Yes.
So I could decipher some of them. So I plan to go back and transcribe them, because I created a book for my mom for her 80th birthday. And I put copies of those letters, and it showed family migration to the United States, and it showed daily life in Barbados. There's so much you can learn
Yes,
from
there
those
is.
things. Yeah, it showed daily life in Barbados of her sending um handwritten notes by a mail from, like, in town to the country. But she was so apologetic for writing in pencil as opposed to pen, you
Yes.
know, and that blew me away. So it's like,
Yes, Marietta. And also postcards. You see postcards in these boxes where they're mailed from one person in Barbados to the other person, because of course there are no telephones. So,
yeah,
you know, the strong boxes are wonderful, whether it's a tin, it's a mahogany box, or it's a cardboard box. I urge people not to throw away anything that they find under the bed of an elderly person or in a cupboard. You know, I'm
yeah,
a great hoarder of these things. So but I'm pleased to hear your response and to hear from you. And I can share with the audience that your family is very important to the stories in Barbados. And we look forward to hearing from you. I hope that you will visit here with Harriet. And maybe we can also have you share with in a genealogy session one of these days.
I would love to, because, you know, my mom is going to be 94. And her memory is like her father's memory, because, you know, he lived to 113.
Yeah.
And her memory is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
And her first cousin, he's 100 and still driving on the island, actually.
Yes. You know, it's funny, Marietta, because people ask me all the time, I'm born in 1956. How could I have a father born in 1891? Well, he had good stamina. He had me at 65. He had me at 65 years old. And I think you're a product of,
Wow.
I think you're a product of that kind of, you know, wrong provisions, swimming in the sea, exercising, riding a bicycle,
Riding a
and doing
bicycle.
everything in moderation.
Yeah, it's just phenomenal. My next trip home, I don't know when that will be. I would love to connect with you, because some of the research that you did will point me in areas where I need to further research on him, because what I was able to get, I have copies of the births of granddaddy's grandparents, birth and marriage certificates, and they got married in Christchurch at the parish hall.
Sorry to have to cut you off, but we have quite a few people waiting
So
online, so we will pick up this conversation later. Okay.
no problem. Thank you for letting me speak. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you. We have Tina Nurse, who is asking if you found any instances of nurses migrating into Barbados.
Into Barbados?
Yes.
I would not have found any incidences like that. I know who I'm speaking to because we've had a brief contact on email. And I would say that I am aware of Barbadians with surname Nurse from St. Philip who went into Guyana. And they then, some of them and their descendants may have re-entered Barbados and into Great Britain as well, and into the United States, descendants of the persons who left, the white persons who left post-emancipation and went into Guyana, and relationships developed with non-white persons in Guyana, and families of non-white persons developed. And I am aware of a particular family and a member who went into the United States. Back into Barbados, I'm not au fait with that, and I hope that maybe you will shed light on that when we do have a chance to discuss the matter more.
Okay, we have intervention from our Facebook feed, Serifa Cornell. She said that was a lovely presentation, Marcia. I have been told that as Black Bajans, we cannot know for sure if our surnames are from owners of ancestors or if they were just given by a priest. What do you think?
I would say that in the broad research I've conducted, there are instances where it is clear that a name came from the enslaver at 1834 or between the periods 1817 to 34. There are other instances where a name was allocated by a priest, and that's clear, like in the one I just gave. The incident I gave, the Christian names were actually, I believe, I don't think that my great-great-grandmother Polly could have known anything about Lord Rohan. So either the priest or the man who owned her allocated that name. With surnames, there are so many different ways that the name could have been applied. In the case of Jane Ann, my great-great-great-grandmother's daughter, her husband, the groom, on that day was given the name Brick Stork. The Brick Storks were a white family in proximity in Willow Rock, in proximity to Newton, and they had a very small estate.
Marcia,
London
sorry,
was
you're
not owned by
muted.
them.
You're muted.
Here, sorry, Trina, I didn't realize I was muted. You didn't hear a word. They're speaking away. Just to recap, very briefly, your question regards to nurses into Barbados. I'm not familiar with, in my research, with nurses coming into Barbados. I am aware of white nurses out of St. Philip who went into Guyana, formed unions with non-white ladies, and families were created. And I'm also aware of members of that family leaving Guyana, white members for Europe and non-white members to the United States. So I'm hoping when you and I speak, because I know who I'm chatting with via email, that we will develop that line that you may be knowledgeable of nurses into Barbados. I think does Trina have something to add to that? Or?
Yeah, thanks, Marcia. I think that answers Tina's question. We have from Marcia, sorry, let me just go back up here a bit. Janice Mears, congratulating you on such detailed work and extensive research. She said that Mary Nurse is recorded as notifying of her husband's death in 1928. Have you any record of her death or burial, Mary Nurse?
No, I'm not familiar with a Mary Nurse of 1928.
You're muted, you're muted.
Sorry, Janice, I'm not aware of a Mary Nurse of 1928. maybe you and I could look at that matter down the road. I don't have a Mary Nurse except the, are you speaking of Barbados, or are you speaking of the person who got married to my uncle and she's named in Chicago as his wife? Is that the Mary you're speaking of?
Okay, well, until Janice responds to that, let's go down to Jane Fraser. Say thank you for a very helpful presentation. And she mentioned the Barbados archives have copies of the church records made in 1855. Then annually thereafter, do the individual churches have the original church records? It's a general.
So yeah, some churches do have records, very old records. I remember I visited St. Matthew's Church many years ago, and they had some very, very old books there of the 1880s period, if I remember correctly. But I think the emphasis has been to have a lot of those books transferred down to the archives. If it's an Anglican baptism, marriage, or burial, I would suggest that you check on familysearch.org, because so many of these records now are available there, and an image of the actual book with the page and the name of the person and all the information is available. And I access familysearch.org and ancestry.com, and I download images of the books that are at the archives. So try Family Search.
Yes, thanks, Elaine. Just want to corroborate what Marcia said. A lot of the church records, the original church records, have been deposited at the archives. So you have not only consolidated records, but some individual church records. Here we have Denise Shepherd Johnson. Again, congratulating you on an excellent presentation and wishing you all the best in your continued research.
Thanks, Denise.
Oh, yes, this is Janice. Janice said you mentioned her, Mary, in your uncle Roy Henry's burial in 1928. So yes, it is that person.
Yes, Janice. I am trying to find out whether she is an American born or within the islands or somewhere else. I haven't been able to find their marriage. She's listed as his wife on the burial record in Chicago, but I haven't been able to access. I'm hoping to be in Chicago at some point. I went there many years ago, not even knowing that my uncle had died there. I went there many, many years ago. So that's all on the list of things to be done once I keep years young.
Okay, we actually have Buddy Laurier who wishes to speak on mic. Reverend Laurier, you can speak. Just unmute and speak. Reverend Laurier, do you still wish to speak?
Yes, thank you. Just to congratulate
I'm not
Mercy.
hearing you.
I can hear you.
You're not hearing me?
I can hear you, buddy.
Okay, just to thank you, Marcy, for a very dynamic and thorough presentation, as usual. So I wouldn't miss this for nothing. So thank you very much. That's basically all I want to say.
Thank you, buddy. Thanks for being there, and you keep well.
Same to you, my dear.
Thank you very much, Reverend Laurier. And thank everyone for their questions and comments. It was a fantastic presentation. Marcia took us through her journey into a multiplicity of records, and also how to interpret those records. I think these are two things that we need to come away with. The type of records that Marcia accessed and how she actually read those records. So thank you so much, Marcia.
You're welcome.
We look forward to hearing from you again in the group. Thank all of you out there, those on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Thank you all so much for attending this evening's presentation and for supporting the group throughout 2022. We look forward to continuing this engagement in 2023. Just want to let you know that our next meeting is scheduled for January 26th. We will have Dr. Rosalind Russell, who will speak on the topic Connecting Oceans, Barbadians in Australia. Those of you who will be with us for the year will know that we started the year by looking at Barbadians in Africa. And over the time, we've been looking at Barbadians in other jurisdictions. So this is the continuation of that theme. So thank you all again. And on the behalf of the group's executive, I wish you all a joyful festive season and all the best for 2023, and be safe. Goodbye for now.
Bye.